Okay, so before we get started on this video, I just have one small addition to the last video, which is that I forgot to mention that in November of 1840, Erastus's sawmill burnt down. I got a bit distracted by talking about the secession crisis, so I skipped over that, and upon rewatching that video before I was done editing this one, I noticed that I missed it, so just a little more context. Erastus's sawmill burnt down in November of 1860. We don't have the date, but we know that it was in November because it was added in like little notes, and it didn't even have the date, but it was like, oh, other events this month is this guy's sawmill burnt down. So I just wanted to add that in, and now back to your regularly scheduled program. All right, the story of Erastus Buck, Charleston's hometown hero, part 2. Now, I hope you watched the first installment of this, but if not, let's be honest, on rewatches you might skip to this part, because this is what everyone's actually interested in, the beginning of Army life. Now, you may notice I'm not in my actual uniform, I'm in kind of a crappy, barely trying, and that's because the men weren't immediately issued with uniforms. In fact, I should go into it. So, like I ended off last time, he went to St. Johnsbury. At St. Johnsbury, they were at Camp Baxter for 10 days. And actually, I have a photo of them, their time there. Notice they are not in uniform yet. And when they are supplied with uniforms, they are supplied with Vermont uniforms, not federal uniforms. Vermont uniforms by Merrill & Co. of Reading, Vermont. And these are actually gray uniforms, because until the confusion that happened at First Bull Run, there wasn't really uniform standards yet. In fact, it took a while to adopt after that, which I'll get back into later. But they first drill with no uniforms, then they get their Merrill & Co. uniforms, which was the Vermont uniform, so they didn't match everyone else, but you know, they had their flags to guide them, so that worked at the beginning. So they drilled for 10 days, and then on July 26th, at a strength of 882 officers and men, they leave for Washington under the command of Colonel William F. Smith. Yes, the famous William Baldy Smith. They, of course, travel south, not on foot, but on rail. They stopped in Bellow Falls, Vermont, where they were, quote, furnished with good dinner free. And the train then continued to Springfield, Massachusetts, where the regiment had supper. Now, if you're like me, dinner and supper mean the same thing. What up, my fellow Zoomers? So I now have an in-the-field reporter asking a boomer relative what the difference is. Take it away. So as we sit down for Thanksgiving dinner, can you, someone who grew up on a Vermont farm, tell me the difference between supper and dinner?
Dinner you have at noontime, and supper you have after chores.
Okay, thank you. Wow, thanks for that blast from the past. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. The train continued to New Haven, Connecticut, where at 10 p.m. Erastus boarded a steamboat for Jersey City. The regiment would disembark the next morning around 8. Then at 3 in the afternoon, the regiment boarded boxcars headed for D.C., where they would arrive at 3 a.m. 2 days later. Erastus also makes a note regarding the locals in Baltimore, quote, "We were treated well at Baltimore and saw no signs of insurrections there. There are any quantity of rebels, but they dare not make a move." End quote. This was, of course, surprising, as Erastus was concerned about Baltimore due to the riot that had happened earlier that year, which was started when Southern sympathizers in Baltimore threw bricks and cobblestone at Union troops. The soldiers, however, had been warned this would probably happen, and had orders not to fire unless fired upon, with the 6th Massachusetts Regiment being told, quote, "Pay no attention to the mob, even if they throw stones, bricks, or other missiles. But if you are fired upon and any one of you is hit, your officers will order you to fire." So not even just only fired when fired upon. If you are fired upon, your officers will then order you to fire. Do not independent fire. Some men in the mob begin to brandish pistols, and either one of them shoots or one of the soldiers fires without orders. What's known is that multiple shots are fired, and bricks and stones from the unarmed civilians begin being thrown harder. Through the struggle, the troops make it through Baltimore. However, they do suffer 41 casualties, with 5 of those being death. However, as most of these civilians were unarmed, seeing that they had thought it wise to assail properly armed men with bricks and stones, they suffered the worst of the losses, which leads me to give a bit of advice to anyone watching this video. The best thing to bring to a gunfight is a gun. Just a warning. So, at least a dozen rioters were killed, more were wounded, but you didn't exactly want to report your wounds because you had just fought the government, so we don't really know the casualties on the civilian side other than they suffered the worst for it. That's what we know. This actually partially led to Maryland's secession vote, which it held 10 days after the riot. This vote was held not in Annapolis, Maryland, which is the capital, as the federal government was now occupying it as a transportation hub, and not in Baltimore, which was another important city at the time, because, it was actually still under mob rule, even though the riot was over. The mob was still controlling the city, and the police had barely gotten in time to help the Union troops escape, but they weren't really enough force to put the riot down, which I know is surprising when it comes to riots in Baltimore, but, Baltimore's always been a bit of a slightly rioty place. Not as bad as Philly, but, they still know how to have a good time. Anyway, back on topic. The vote was held in Frederick, Maryland, which, due to some intervention involving the transportation of legislators from the capital or from their home seats to Frederick, which is now in a different location and nearly bordering Pennsylvania, wonder why it got changed to Frederick, somehow only 66 votes were cast, and 53 of them were to remain. Wow, what a landslide with the numbers who actually got there. This vote was on April 29th, and 2 weeks later, martial law was declared in Baltimore, leading to it being safe to pass through by the time Erastus arrived on July 28th, 1861. Sorry if that was a big tangent, but I had planned on covering the Pratt Street riots, the 1861 Baltimore riot is also known as the Pratt Street riot, as it largely happened on Pratt Street. Good job. So, I wanted to cover it before, but I figured I'd sneak it in this video. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah. Erastus arrived in D.C. at 3 a.m., Saturday, July 29th, 1861. Then, at 3 p.m. the same day, the regiment marched for 1.5 hours south till they reached Camp Lyon. Lyon with a Y, by the way. Their baggage, however, didn't arrive till 8 p.m., and at which point they decided just to sleep under the stars. It was summer, they'd be fine, and they'd deal with setting up camp in the morning, which I'm surprised they got away with. I would honestly expect some hard-nosed officer to be like, oh no, we have to set up camp, but they were allowed to just sleep in the open, which might not have been the best idea with all the bugs, but, they were fine with it. Speaking of things they were fine with, well, at least for now, Erastus closes his letter by describing the army rations that they've been getting, describing the men being fed on, quote, hard bread and salt beef and pork, coffee and tea, beans and rice. I may have mentioned that Erastus had a one-room schoolhouse education. That is a horrible run-on sentence, but he got the information across. Erastus also says that he's in good health. So although army food may not always be appetizing, it was keeping him healthy. And that actually concludes, as I said, his first letter, which I somehow got 2 videos out of, but I'm sure I won't be able to milk the rest of this book that badly. I mean, I surely can't turn 10 letters written during the war into 2 hours of content, can I? Anyway, see you for part 3.